When Christine Bicknell woke up on the 10th of August 2012, she immediately knew that something was wrong. It was a feeling she just couldn't shake, and the feeling came with a bad smell. So she rummaged through the house, looked in the trash, cleaned and cleaned, but still she couldn't get rid of the rotten smell which had been lingering in her home for days. Then she heard a pounding at her front door. The police were here for the 5th time in a week. For a moment, she thought that they might have an update about her missing granddaughter Tia, or maybe they had come to ask more questions on top of the thousands she had already answered. But Christine was wrong on both counts. They weren't there to talk. They were there to search. Natalie Sharp was a teenager when she gave birth to her daughter Tia on June the 30th, 2000, in Croydon, South London. When she held her little girl in her arms, Natalie felt as if she was holding a gift, as if Santa had come early and delivered everything she had ever asked for. Natalie's mother, Christine Bicknell, attended the birth of her granddaughter that day. As she stared down at the sweet cherub face, she felt what she described as untold love. The trio of Tia, Natalie and Christine would spend the next 12 years of Tia's life becoming more like very close friends than the mother, daughter and grandmother they were. By then, Tia had grown into a pretty typical preteen era. She was considered small for her age at 4 foot 5 inches, but her personality filled every room she entered. Tia was never shy about expressing herself, and she always knew exactly what she wanted. Her mother described her as the colour of all colours, a radiant, lively spirit who shone with happiness and energy. Her vibrant personality was like a beacon, and she never had any trouble making friends. But from where Tia was standing, her best friends were her family. Over the years, more people joined the close circle the trio formed. In the year 2002, a man named Stuart Hazell was introduced to the family. At the time, Christine was working as a barmaid at a small pub known as the Rains Parks Tavern in South London. Stuart was a slim man with bright blue eyes and blonde hair that he kept cropped close to his scalp. His arms were tattooed and his face was weathered from years of alcohol abuse. Despite the fact that he had a bit of a checkered past, Christine and Stuart hit it off right away. Christine wasn't one to judge, and she had a bit of a reputation of her own in the area. Those who knew her described Christine as being uncouth and foul-mouthed. Christine's life had its own hardships. She was 15 years old when she gave birth to her first and only child, Natalie, Tia's mother. Christine married Natalie's father, but the relationship fell apart after they had been together for 18 years. A few years later, she met and married another guy, but that relationship was short-lived. Not long after it ended, she met Stuart. Christine and Stuart didn't immediately start a romantic relationship after that first meeting. In fact, her daughter Natalie started dating Stuart. That relationship was also not built to last, and after a few weeks of dating, they went their separate ways. 2 years later, Christine and Stuart started dating. People who knew both women said that Christine was not bothered by the fact that Stuart had previously dated her daughter, and it appeared that Natalie did not mind either. By then, she was married to another man, David Niles, and the couple had 2 children together. Even though David wasn't Tia's biological father, he treated her as if she was his own. But life for young Tia was far from perfect or safe. Tia lived with her mother and David and her 2 half-siblings in an apartment in Mitcham, South London. Mitcham is a district in the London borough of Merton. It's a suburban area known for its mix of residential properties, green spaces, and diverse community. It's also known for its historic buildings and landmarks like the Mitcham Cricket Green, which is one of the oldest cricket grounds still in use today. But despite its rich history and community spirit, Mitcham has faced various social challenges over the years, and like many parts of London, it has areas that struggle with crime, poverty and housing issues. And right in the middle of all of that was Tia's little home. To make matters worse, Natalie and David had been referred to social services and child protection services on 3 separate occasions. 2 of those investigations involved them allegedly using Class A drugs around the 3 children who lived with them. The other report of concern was sparked by an argument between Natalie and David, which had become so volatile that the police were called to their home. One of the reports described the living situation as dysfunctional. But social services had another reason to be concerned, particularly when it came to Tia. She was a bright kid and she did well in school when she was there, but she was often absent from her classes. Even though there were clearly issues in the household which were affecting Tia's education, the investigations into Natalie and David were eventually dropped, and Tia was never placed on any at-risk register. Tia's life was far from conventional, but she never let that stop her from dreaming. She adored music, and she would often be caught singing her heart out into her BlackBerry phone, which had become a makeshift microphone. She also loved movies, and she had dreams of becoming a star and having her name in lights. It's a cruel irony that her name would one day be splashed across newspapers, magazines, and television shows, just not in the way she could ever have dreamed. Given how tense things often were at Tia's home, it's no surprise that she would often find refuge at her grandmother's place. Tia liked that she had more space there, and it was much less chaotic than her apartment, with David and the 2 younger kids filling up every inch. It also helped that Tia had a great relationship with both Christine and Stuart. Since her grandmother worked during the night, Tia would spend a lot of time alone with Stuart when she was over at her grand's house. They would play games on the PlayStation and go on expeditions, which was really just code for trips to the store for groceries. But it was more than her mum or stepdad had time for. Tia and Stuart were so close that she even called him Grandad. Christine once said about Stuart, quote, "He was good with kids. He was good with the house. I don't know, at some point he was everything that she needed." End quote. It's easy to see why Tia and Stuart were so close. She was a young girl whose life seemed to be in constant upheaval. She never knew her biological dad, and her mum described him as nothing more than a sperm donor. The one place she should have felt safe, her home, was the subject of investigation, and she was unable to consistently go to school thanks to all of this turmoil. So it's easy to see how she might have found refuge with Stuart. In many ways, he was the only steady male figure in her life. Which is why no one thought twice when Tia said she wanted to stay the night at her grandmother's house on the 2nd of August 2012. Her mother dropped her off at the tram platform and arranged for Stuart to pick her up at the other end. It might be a bit unusual to imagine a young girl travelling through London on her own, but it's important to remember that Tia was pretty independent, and she had made this trip plenty of times before. Like many kids who have been raised in dysfunctional homes, Tia had grown up fast. She was street smart and familiar with which platform to get off at and where to find Stuart. Just as Tia had done so many times before, she got on the tram, made her journey through the city, and found Stuart waiting for her right where she expected. On the drive back to Christine's, Stuart and Tia decided to stop at a supermarket for snacks. CCTV cameras recorded while they browsed the store. Tia is the one dressed in a yellow tank top, leggings, and what looks like Ugg boots. Her brown hair was tucked into a messy bun, and she was wearing the black wireframe glasses that she never left home without. A small duffel bag was slung over her shoulder, and she wandered through the store as her granddad picked up a few groceries. At one point, Tia stopped at the magazine display and took one off the shelf. She stared at the pages for a little while, placed it back on the counter, and walked over to Stuart. Shortly after that, the two of them left the store together. The footage from this afternoon shop is not alarming in the slightest. Neither of them looks anxious or frightened. It's simply a preteen girl running errands with her granddad. But this footage would be one of the last times that Tia was ever seen alive. After finishing at the store, Tia and Stuart made their way back home and settled in to watch TV. Christine called later that evening to make sure that Tia had arrived and that everything was going okay. She could hear her granddaughter giggling in the background, and after Stuart confirmed everything was good, Christine hung up the phone and went back to work. The next morning, on Friday the 3rd of August 2012, Christine finished up her shift and headed home. As soon as she got home, she crawled into bed and went to sleep. When she got up later that afternoon, she found Stuart lying on the couch watching TV. There was no sign of Tia, but not to fear. She was simultaneously a preteen who loved to sleep in, as well as being pretty independent and going off on her own. She also knew the other kids in the area and was familiar with how to find her way back to Christine's. So when Christine asked where her granddaughter was, and Stuart told her that Tia had gone into town to buy some shoes, she didn't worry. But the hours passed and the afternoon turned into evening. When 6 p.m. rolled around and Tia was still not home, Christine knew that something was off. She picked up the phone and called Natalie. Maybe Tia had gone back home for the night, or perhaps she had let her mother know where she was going. But when Christine spoke to Natalie, her breath caught in her chest. Natalie had no idea where Tia was. In fact, she had been trying to reach her daughter all day, but Tia hadn't answered any of her phone calls or Facebook messages. Not answering the phone was unheard of for Tia. Panic began to set in. There was no way Tia would go off on her own without telling anyone. After that phone call, Christine, Natalie, and Stuart decided that they needed to start searching for Tia. They hoped that she was just around the neighbourhood and that time had gotten away from her, or that maybe she had missed the bus back from town. Even though she had never been late before, she would not be the first preteen to miss curfew. But after hours of searching, there was no sign of Tia. By 10 p.m, they knew that it was time to get the authorities involved. The three of them walked into the police station together and reported Tia missing. The first thing the police did was establish Tia's movements on the morning of August the 3rd. Stuart told the police that Tia had told him she was going into town and she'd left at around midday. He watched her leave the house, and that was the last he had seen of her. At first glance, the police must have looked at Stuart with heavy suspicion. He was a man with a checkered past and the last person known to have seen a young girl who had gone missing. But when police officers spoke to neighbours of Stuart and Christine, they found someone who was able to corroborate his story. Paul Meehan told the police that he had seen Tia leave the house and walk past his front door just after midday, the same time that Stuart had said. The police also carried out a search on Christine and Stuart's home, but they found nothing suspicious. What they did find, though, was something that gave them cause for concern. They found Tia's phone. Even then, digital devices were like an extra limb for kids Tia's age. Why would she not have taken it with her? While the neighbourhood was canvassed, investigators explored other avenues to track Tia down. Given that the UK is one of the most surveilled places in the world, and there are more than 5.2 million CCTV cameras in operation, the police believed that CCTV footage would give them a strong lead in finding Tia. But combing through every piece of footage from the area would take a significant amount of manpower. Ultimately, they sourced about 800 hours of footage which was focused on popular places in the area, such as the bus route into town and the Croydon town centre. Police combed through frame after frame of footage, but after many hundreds of hours of watching, they couldn't find a single trace of Tia. They were stumped. How could a little girl leave a house and vanish into thin air? A detective working on the case said, quote, "It was like she walked out the front door and fell down a hole," end quote. The fact that the police had found nothing when they searched the home and that a witness had corroborated the time when Tia left meant the investigation was heavily focused on the local community, which meant that instead of having one or two leads or suspects, everyone in the town of Croydon could be considered a person of interest. In the media, there are certain cases which seem to garner more attention than others. Bad news is so common that we can find ourselves pretty desensitized to the horrors of the world, but there are always stories which seem to tug at people's heartstrings or stick in our minds. Tia's disappearance was one of them. When the media caught wind of her going missing, news vans and concerned citizens descended on Christine's home. People wanted to know how a 12-year-old could disappear in broad daylight, and they wanted to know what they could do to find her. Mass search parties were organised, and Christine, Natalie and Stuart led nearly all of them. Everyone wore t-shirts with Tia's name and face on them, and together they scoured every shadowy corner of the city. But still, there was no sign of the brown-eyed girl with the sweet smile. As a sense of desperation descended on the local residents, different members of Tia's family started speaking to the public. Her stepfather David told reporters, quote, "I was in Tia's life from when she was just 4 years old, so she grew up seeing me as her dad. I loved her like she was my own daughter," end quote. Her uncle made his own television appearance, and he said, "Come home, you are not in any kind of trouble." A distraught Stuart looked directly into a camera while he pleadingly begged, "Tia, come home, babe." Having a massive media presence can be beneficial, especially with missing child cases. More media means more eyes on the lookout and more chances that someone will see something and report it to officials. That's true of Tia's case as well. The police received a flood of calls from people who were positive they had seen Tia, but sadly, none of these leads ever panned out into genuine sightings. As days went by with no sign of Tia, investigators decided to go right back to the beginning and take a second look at the evidence they had gathered so far. They had been told that Tia left the house at around midday, but aside from the neighbour Paul and her step-granddad Stuart, no one else had seen her that day, and she wasn't on any of the CCTV footage from the surrounding area. Something was just not adding up. They had to consider that perhaps the people they had talked to had not been as truthful as they made themselves out to be. The police started to look at Stuart, and this time it was with more than a little bit of suspicion. I know, it always seems like it's going to be the stepdad, or in this case a step-granddad, who is to blame when a child goes missing, and Stuart clearly sensed the same thing. Right after the police began looking at him more closely, he agreed to an interview with a television station. On the 9th of August, 1 week after Tia was last seen, Stuart sat down with ITV. In the interview, he was dressed in a white t-shirt with Tia's face on it, and he sat on a couch next to Tia's uncle. Both men looked devastated, as if the weight of Tia's disappearance might be more than they could bear. Stuart started off by retelling his version of what happened the day Tia went missing. He said that he was doing chores that morning and Tia was being her normal chatty self. At around 12:10, she walked to the door and said that she was just popping into town to buy some flip-flops. As she went to leave, Stuart says he reminded her that her curfew was 6 p.m, and she replied, yeah. Then she walked out the front door of the home he shared with Christine. This was exactly the same story he had told detectives. But then Stuart went off script. He suggested a possible explanation as to why Tia's phone was found in the house. He says that he would always tell Tia to stop messing with her phone while it was charging. He went into great detail about how she would put the phone on charge but then text on it while it was still plugged in. Stuart said that he had told Tia to leave her phone on charge the day she disappeared, but he didn't anticipate that she would interpret that as meaning that she should leave her phone at home while she went out. This version of events did go some way to explaining why a preteen would leave her phone behind. Then the interviewer asked Stuart how he was dealing with all the media attention. The media had started to become suspicious of Stuart, and they were spinning their own tales of what they thought had happened. Stuart looked increasingly irate as he described one reporter asking if he had done anything to Tia. Quote, "No, I effing didn't. I'd never think of that. I loved her to bits. She's like my own daughter, for God's sake. We had that sort of relationship. It was that sort of thing." End quote. As Stuart sat there defending himself, he appeared like the definition of a desperate man. But was he desperate to find Tia, or desperate for people to believe him? On the 10th of August, one day after Stuart's ITV interview, Christine woke up to a pungent smell. Stuart had already left, and she found herself home alone, searching high and low for where it came from. A little while later, the police showed up to her house yet again. This wasn't anything new or shocking for Christine. In the week since Tia had disappeared, police had searched her home on 4 separate occasions. So when they asked if she would leave so they could search the home again, she left without saying anything. The police went through the home in the same order they had in all of the previous searches. They worked their way through the bedrooms and the living spaces, but this time they took a much deeper look into the loft space between the roof and the ceiling. And this time they saw something different. That's not entirely accurate, because before they saw it, they smelt it. When they followed the pungent smell into the far side of the loft, they saw a dark outline of something which had been wrapped in bin bags. Underneath the bin bags on the floor of the loft was a bed sheet. As they slowly started to peel the layers of bin bags off the dark shape, they were met with a horrendous sight. Lying in a small, dark crawl space in her grandmother's home was the body of 12-year-old Tia Sharp. The missing girl they had been looking for a week had been right under their noses and above their heads the whole time. The gruesome discovery of Tia's body in plastic bags prompted investigators to turn their attention to the 2 people who had been living with Tia's body for an entire week, Christine and Stuart. They immediately arrested Christine and went out looking for their second suspect, but he was nowhere to be found. Are we surprised that Stuart had made a run for it? Almost immediately, the police made a public appeal for information regarding Stuart's whereabouts. It didn't take long for the tips to come in. After all, he'd been on TV just the day before, and his image was still fresh in everyone's mind. When officers tracked him down, they found him in a somewhat surprising situation. See, Stuart hadn't left town. It turns out that when he left the house that morning, he had sensed the gig was up. The house had started to smell, and other people would start to notice soon. So he did what any self-respecting man would do. He ran to the store at the crack of dawn and bought a bottle of vodka. He was seen on CCTV footage sobbing in front of a little girl before wandering off to a park to get pass out drunk. A member of the public recognised his face and tipped off the police to his location. Minutes after the call was received, the police went to the park and arrested Stuart for Tia's murder. Once he'd sobered up enough for an interview, Stuart was asked, "What can you tell us about the murder of Tia Sharp?" Stuart sat next to the detective and looked down for a long moment. It almost seemed as if he hadn't heard the question until a detective called his name. Then Stuart scratched his head and began to speak. Investigators might have expected Stuart to either profess his innocence or confess that he was a cold-blooded child killer, but he did neither. Instead, he asked to speak to a lawyer. That lawyer advised him not to give a statement, and he was transported to a holding cell. The following day, Christine was released from prison and the police officially ruled her out as a suspect. Their investigation indicated that only one person was responsible for this terrible crime. Things were not looking good for Stuart. He refused to speak to the police without a lawyer present, but he couldn't resist the urge to make a few attempts at justifying Tia's murder. He allegedly told a prison guard that Tia's death had been a mistake. He said they had been innocently playing at the top of the stairs when Tia had slipped and fallen down to her death. He thought that maybe she was okay, but because he had too many drinks that night, he passed out rather than check on her. When he woke up, he realized that Tia was dead, and he didn't know what to do. He felt guilty for not trying to do more after she fell, so he wrapped her body up in a sheet and plastic bags and put her in the loft. This was just the first of many stories that Stuart would run with. But proving the truth of what actually happened was going to be more difficult than the investigators might have anticipated. First of all, the medical examiner was unable to determine Tia's cause of death because of the advanced state of decomposition. Consider that roof cavities are like windowless ovens. The heat of the day warms up the cavity and there's nowhere for the hot air to escape, so it just gets hotter and hotter. And Tia's murder occurred in August, which is summer in the United Kingdom. Tia's body had been wrapped in plastic bags in a small hot space for 7 days by the time her remains were discovered. But even with this complexity, the medical examiner was certain that Tia had not died from an injury caused by a fall. It was much more likely she had died from being smothered or suffocated. The medical examiner's report wasn't the only thing that discounted Stuart's version of events. What had been found in Christine's home during that final search was also pretty damning. First of all, they found another bin bag in the same area where Tia's body had been found. It contained a bloody shirt which appeared to belong to Stuart. The blood was later matched to Tia. They also found a broken pair of spectacles and some other pieces of Tia's clothing. None of the items were consistent with her having fallen down the stairs. But the most damning piece of evidence was found in the most obscure hiding place. During that final search, the police had recovered a tiny memory card which had been tucked against a door frame. Later in the same search, they discovered a second memory card. When they looked at the first card, they discovered that everything on it had been deleted. But just because someone presses delete doesn't mean that it's gone forever. In this case, data recovery specialists were able to recover all of the information from the memory card, and what they found made this case even more disturbing. It all started with a picture of Tia. In the photo, she is unclothed and posed in an explicit position. She appears to be on her grandmother's bed, and blood can be seen behind her on the sheets. In the far corner of the picture is a tiny heartbreaking detail. Her favourite doll is lying on the bed next to her. The picture itself is already horrifying enough, but the doll being there really brings home just how young Tia was. She was a little girl who should have been safe to play with dolls at her granny's house. To make matters worse, the medical examiner concluded that Tia had been posed in this way after her death. The memory card also contained a gallery of other explicit pictures which Stuart had taken of himself. In them, he strikes poses and uses toys on himself. A toy found at the scene also had Tia's blood on it. This evidence indicated pretty clearly, in my opinion, that Tia's murder was sexually motivated. The extent of Stuart's depravity was only just starting to reveal itself. The memory cards continued to tell the secrets that Stuart had managed to hide for so long. On those cards, police found videos Stuart had recorded of Tia without her knowledge. In some videos, she's putting lotion on her legs. In others, she's fast asleep, unaware that the man she thinks of as a protector is actually her biggest threat. It's also clear that Stuart went to extreme lengths to film this content. In some of the photos and videos, his shadow is visible over Tia while she sleeps. Christine later told detectives that Stuart had removed the bathroom door. It was only after Tia's death she realized this was so that he could watch her as she bathed. Investigators also found spy holes in Tia's bedroom walls. With the passage of time, Stuart's voyeurism escalated. Experts called in to review this case believe that at some point he convinced himself that Tia was in love with him. However, he also knew that what he was doing was wrong and that he would never be able to live out his deepest fantasies. So he turned to porn, where any fantasy under the sun is freely available with the click of a button. Stuart started to search for terms about relations between family members. He also hunted for underage videos, and then he searched for girls with glasses. Remember, Tia wore glasses. For a while, his depravity was limited to the videos he consumed on his phone and the photos he captured of Tia. But one day, the temptation to bring his fantasies into reality became too much for him, and he decided to do something about it. To this day, Stuart has never provided a true account of what he did to Tia that night. All we have to go on is what investigators have pieced together from the evidence. According to this, Christine called her boyfriend to find out how he and Tia were doing. She said that she could hear Tia laughing in the background. At 12 minutes past 10 p.m, Stuart sent Christine a message letting her know that Tia had finished watching her show and had gone to bed. About an hour and a half later, at 11:44 p.m, he sent her another message bidding Christine good night. Meanwhile, Tia's phone records show that she stayed up late texting her friend on BlackBerry Messenger. At around 42 minutes past 12, she and her friend stopped texting. This is likely the time when she went to sleep. It's also likely the time when Stuart went into her room and either tried to do something to her while she slept or began taking videos or pictures of her. Investigators believe that unlike the other times this happened, Tia woke up and she saw what he was doing. She may have threatened to tell her mother or grandmother what Stuart had done, and perhaps he panicked. Fueled by his fear of the consequences of being caught, Stuart killed Tia. After he murdered her, he put her on her grandmother's bed where he posed her. The picture of Tia on the bed is thought to have been taken between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. on the morning of the 3rd of August. As far as DNA evidence goes, semen was found on the bedsheet and Tia's blood and her DNA were found on Stuart's belt. Once he was done taking pictures of her, he dressed Tia in the pajamas she had gone to bed in. Then he wrapped her body in a bedsheet and bin bags and used sticky tape to secure it. He climbed into the loft, shoved her into the corner with his own shirt and anything else which had blood on it. By the time Christine woke up the next afternoon, Stuart had covered his crime so well that she had no idea her grandbaby was lying dead just 12 feet above her head. She slept in that house for days, grieving the disappearance of her beloved little girl, and she was grateful to have her wonderful boyfriend by her side to support her at her lowest point. Little did she know that while she searched high and low for her grandchild, Stuart was searching for schoolgirl porn. Now, according to Stuart, his troubled childhood is to blame for Tia's murder. He claims that his relationship with his father was pretty much non-existent because his dad was in prison, and his relationship with his mother wasn't much better because she was a prostitute who had no time to raise a child. That left Stuart with nowhere to go but straight into the child welfare system. As he entered the world of teenagehood, Stuart started to get in trouble at school and with the law. By the age of 13, he already had his first taste of alcohol, which became a substance he was heavily dependent on throughout his life. At age 14, he received his first conviction. When Stuart was 16, he became homeless and found shelter in a hostel in Soho, where he was apparently SA'd. This childhood trauma and early introduction into mind-altering substances caused Stuart to suffer from depression, which sparked bouts of self-harm and numerous life-ending attempts. He also became heavily dependent on drugs to go along with the drink. During Stuart's murder trial, a psychiatrist diagnosed that they believe Stuart suffered from what is known as unsocialized conduct disorder. People with this disorder are rejected by their peers, and to deal with the feelings of rejection, they exhibit violent and aggressive behaviour. Stuart's rap sheet seems to line up with this diagnosis. He clearly has trouble regulating his emotions, and his history tells us he turns to violence to deal with certain situations. His record goes all the way back to the 1990s, but the convictions worth noting are those he received in the early 2000s. Let's begin in 2001, when he was convicted of disorderly behaviour, and even though he did not serve any time for that charge, he was given a fine. The next year, he was convicted for a racially aggravated common assault. A year later, he served 34 months for the distribution of cocaine. Allegedly, he was part of a gang that was known to cause trouble in the neighbourhood. One day, he and a couple of his buddies were caught with bags of cocaine and heroin concealed in their underwear and mouths. You might think that entering into a serious long-term relationship with Christine could have slowed Stuart down a bit and kept him out of trouble, but that could not be further from the truth. In 2010, after 3 years of dating, Stuart was back in prison again for 12 months. The events that led to his imprisonment began at a pub called the Randall Tavern. Stuart started causing trouble, and eventually those around him got sick of his antics, and he was asked to leave. Stuart didn't take too kindly to being separated from his beverage, because shortly after leaving the tavern, he returned with a machete. The landlord saw him charging up the path with the machete and locked the doors and called the police. After this conviction, Stuart continued to rack up charges, from assault to burglary. Despite Stuart's inability to keep his temper in check, Christine continued dating and living with him. Perhaps he managed to keep his rage out of the home, and perhaps with Christine he was the picture-perfect boyfriend. But even that is not necessarily true. Christine admits that at times he would have too much to drink and become, in her words, argumentative. She also admits that he would smoke marijuana in front of her grandkids, and that she begged him to stop smoking in front of Tia, but he continued to do it anyway. Stuart was not winning any awards for Grandparent of the Year, and yet both Natalie and Christine continued to leave Tia in his sole care. Maybe they overlooked certain things because of how good he seemed to be with Tia, or because of how much Tia seemed to love him. In fact, on the afternoon before Tia went over to her grandmother's house for the last time, Natalie texted her daughter to let her know that Christine wasn't going to be home that night, and that she would be alone with Stuart. When Natalie asked if Tia was still comfortable to go, Tia responded with a resounding yes, 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 yes. As for the question about whether Stuart could have been stopped before Tia's murder, it's important to note that none of Stuart's previous convictions had been for anything that involved SA crimes or violence towards children. But that's a pretty low benchmark, given how long his record was. Tia's mother and grandmother thought that Stuart loved Tia and that he would never put her in harm's way. But he turned out to be the harm, and they handed her to him on a silver platter. When the time came for Stuart to stand trial for Tia's murder, everyone waited with bated breath to hear how he was going to plead. Surely, with the evidence stacked against him, he would admit defeat and spare Tia's family the pain of sitting through the explicit details of her final moments. But that is not what he chose to do. Stuart pleaded not guilty to all charges. On the 7th of May 2013, his murder trial began. The prosecutors methodically went through each piece of evidence they had found in the home and on Stuart's memory cards. They played the video Stuart had sneakily recorded of Tia. They showed the picture he had taken of her dead body. And the medical examiner detailed the state of her body. Tia's family sat and listened to it all. Natalie looked at the man that had once been a core part of her family. A man who seemed to be barely affected by what was being said and shown to the court. Here he was being prosecuted for the murder of a girl he had known since she was 4 years old, and yet Natalie said he looked empty. Once it was Stuart's turn to take the stand and tell his side of the story, he chickened out, and then he changed his plea to guilty. Stuart said he did this because Tia's family had suffered enough, but it was too little, too late. Stuart had held out on changing his plea until all the gruesome details of Tia's last hours had been laid bare. If he had truly wanted to spare them more suffering, he would have pleaded guilty earlier. Natalie says that every night before she closes her eyes to sleep, she sees that picture of her baby girl naked on the bed. That picture will haunt her for the rest of her life. If Stuart had pleaded guilty from the start, she would never have seen the photo in the first place. And maybe she wouldn't have to deal with the pain of knowing all the other people in the courtroom had seen that picture too. Even after Stuart claimed to have pleaded guilty to spare Tia's family any more suffering, he still refused to tell them exactly what happened that night. Stuart's sentencing was scheduled for the 14th of May 2013. During the proceedings, Natalie was able to give her victim impact statement. She said, quote, "I gave the ultimate trust to Stuart. Sometimes I feel pity, that I want to hurt him, but I can never hurt him like he has hurt me. She was mine and no one else's. I had someone to love." End quote. When considering the sentence to impose on Stuart, the judge had to consider whether he believed the crime was sexually motivated. If it was, then Stuart would face a life sentence without parole. But the judge determined that even though there were sexual aspects to the crime, the motivation was shame and fear. He said that Stuart was afraid that Tia would expose his dirty secret, and that is why he killed her. Because of this ruling, Stuart was able to receive the minimum term for the crime. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 38 years. He will be eligible for parole at 75 years of age. Even though Stuart has never come clean about what happened that night, he did write a letter to his father while he was awaiting trial. He wrote, quote, "I can't sleep, can't eat. I wish I could turn back the clock, but I can't. I'm sorry to have lied to you all, but I didn't know what to do. If I had the chance, I would end it here and now. I got no money, no cigarettes, no hope. It's the Hazell curse, and I only got myself to blame." End quote. Tia was farewelled in an emotional service held at the St. John Evangelist Church in South London. Because of the coverage of her disappearance, the ceremony was heavily attended by the public and media. As for the neighbour who gave a false statement about seeing Tia leaving the house on the day she went missing, Paul Meehan was actually charged with lying to the police and sentenced to 5 months in jail. According to the judge, he had given the false statement to put himself at the centre of the case. At the time he claimed to have seen Tia, she would already have been dead. In the aftermath of the crime, the public was left both heartbroken and angry. How could Tia have been left in the care of a man with so many convictions for violent crimes? How could social services investigate the family again and again but still fail to protect this little girl? And how could the police have missed her body in 4 previous searches of Christine's home? The police ended up apologising to Tia's family about their failure to search the home effectively. They admitted that they didn't find her body at first because of human error. An officer did actually go into the loft when they did their first search, but he thought that the bags were not heavy enough to be anything important. He says that he also assumed that Tia wouldn't hide in the loft, so she probably wouldn't be in there. A search dog had also gone through the home during one of the earlier searches, but when it signalled that something was above the bedroom, the officers ignored the sign because the dog was too big to get into the loft space. During the apology, the police department acknowledged they had made serious mistakes, and they assured the family and the public that this level of incompetence would never happen again. Even once the case was resolved, Tia's family still made the headlines. It has been alleged that her stepfather David was charging fees of up to $2,500 for a 4-minute interview. Some members of the public also accused Tia's family members of being money and fame hungry. This is one of the more horrific cases I have covered on this channel. It's nothing new that a person in a position of trust can be responsible for such a gruesome murder, but it's the way in which Stuart carried out his crime and the red flags her mother and grandmother overlooked which make this case even more tragic. Children trust their caregivers to care for them, and in this case, they let her down. Yes, we could say there are lessons to be learned, but that's a pretty unhelpful take once the damage is already done. No lesson can bring Tia back or undo the pain her family has endured. Natalie was quoted in one report saying that when the trial ended, the case was over for everyone around her. But for her, the horror of what happened to Tia will haunt her for the rest of her life.